David and Goliath. David and Goliath are two of the most well-known characters from the Bible. And like the patience of Job, another well-known characterization, the David and Goliath story is often mischaracterized. This violent story is most often used to encourage the small and powerless in the face of the big and powerful. But it is a violent story. The dialogue between the combatants is gory. David uses his love of his God, Israel's God, to justify his attack, to explain why Goliath must be beheaded, and why Goliath's head then must be paraded around for all to see. I cut that part out, and I thought we'd had enough, but that after this he does indeed do that. So it's a very familiar excuse we humans use for putting our violence on God, quoting scripture to explain our actions. Just this week, we heard the Attorney General quoting Romans to vindicate the government's actions and policies at the border. And it wasn't more than a few minutes then we heard his critics quoting scripture right back at him. David embraces the challenge of Goliath to exact justice from the Philistines for their disrespect for Israel's God, with the subtext of their disrespect for the country and nation of Israel. David uses his triumph over lions and bears as examples of how God has saved him again and again. Having survived those, he is confident God will arrange for a victory over Goliath as well. Two things. First, God does not need us to defend him. We are asked to glorify God by living our lives as God asks us to. We glorify God with our love. And second, David is right in saying that God is with him. We can always seek God's protection and company. But when we wield God as a weapon, it is a false God we follow and a denial of our own thirst for victory, our own penchant for violence, whether physical or verbal. God will always be with us, bidden or unbidden, but God will always be with the other as well. The German pastor, Martin Niemöller, protested face-to-face with Hitler his anti-Semitic measures and was, not surprisingly, arrested and imprisoned in Dachau. He once confessed, "It took me a long time to learn that God is not the enemy of my enemies. God is not even the enemy of God's enemies." David's lack of self-awareness is so great that he brags about God not using a sword, which might lead us to believe that there's a pacifist tendency, that there's peace here. We might believe that were it not for the fact that, yes, David does not use a sword except to cut off Goliath's head. But he chose another weapon. Young David is held up as the epitome for the small and unsophisticated, overcoming tremendous odds so that the right might triumph. The trust is that Goliath was to blame. The thrust of this is, that's truth. The truth is that Goliath was to blame for his own defeat, his own death. He cloaked himself in armor and intimidated with his size. He felt that he was so defended, so well defended, armor, sword, shield, that he thought he was invincible. And that arrogance, that cowardness of hiding, of denying his human vulnerability under bronze and chainmail, really made him an easy target. David had great aim. Goliath could not bob and weave and duck like a person would when a stone came at him. Like Frankenstein, he could only move clumsily and hope to overwhelm his enemy with his sheer bulk and his heavy sword. He would have been much better off with no sword and no shield. But we know the outcome. We know that David found his small and not prominent, vulnerable spot. And Goliath was a goner. It was one small, smooth stone. A humble weapon, I grant you. But for all intents and purposes, it was a bullet that shot into Goliath's head and killed him. He was indeed brought down by a smaller, less well-defended opponent. His fall left everyone, the Israelites and the Philistines alike, left them astonished. This battle also is a little bit like our national immigration issue and the form it has taken this past week. Politicians and pundits could not change the situation. Former presidents, former first ladies could not get through the armor. It was babies and toddlers who wielded their cries and tears that found the vulnerable spot and forced action. Whether your opponent is armed and shielded by bronze or is defended with words and political power, it is the hiding of their humanity, the illusion of invincibility, the setting oneself apart from the other, from the opponent, that ends in defeat. When those who exclaim that they will protect us, that they alone in bronze and chainmail are uniquely able to withstand the battle. Don't worry, Goliath calms all the Philistines. Look at this guy. He'll be food for worms in about a half an hour. And when those who lead us into battle have separated themselves from the tender, vulnerable nature of being human, we tend to relax our guard just when we are the most at risk. We never want the invincible to lead us into battle. We never want to go for a ride on an unsinkable luxury liner. The disciples who found themselves storm-tossed had quite a different leader, a protector who was in the same boat as they were. Jesus hid none of his humanity, never defended himself physically, and in fact reproached the disciples when they wanted to use violence. When the others armed themselves with law and technicalities, as we know they did, Jesus only responded with questions and parables. He met violence with prayer and death with resurrection. Both of these scriptures are about power, perceived power and real power, about our thinking that we can defend against life's pains and problems with the superhuman, with divine right, and about our missing the wonderful truth that Jesus, that God came to be in the same boat with us, so he could teach us. His authority sprang from his human experience. It is a great error that we have, that we are fully human. We are only fragmentally human, fleetingly human, brokenly human. We see glimpses of our humanness, and we can only dream of what a more human existence and political order would be like, but we have not yet arrived at true humanness. Only God is human, and we are made in God's image and likeness, which is to say, we too are capable of becoming fully human and therefore fully divine. Amen.